We're in the midst of a huge transformation where peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I'm the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I'm super excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Julia Satov. She is the Global Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Litera. Julia, thank you so much for being here. If you're going to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns and when you were younger, do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
I love it. I don't even know if the quotations, because I kind of secretly still want to be. So I laugh when I tell you. But one, thank you so much, Christina, for reaching out. This is a really fantastic opportunity to have a conversation and really appreciate the time. So hello to everyone. My name is Julia Satov again, and my pronouns are she and her and hers. And what did I want to be when I grow up? To be honest, I wanted to be a solid gold dancer. True story, still
Love
do. And I'll tell you, one of the reasons why was at the time, it was really quite popular. And only if I look back at it now, I was like, oh, it was one of the few times I would actually see people up there that were having a great time that represented me and a lot of my culture. So it's a pretty big dream still in the bucket list.
I love it. I have faith that you could still achieve it. It's never too late early. Fast forward to today, I think representation has a lot to do with diversity and inclusion, and want to start out with a broader question around company culture. It's in the title of the interview series. With all of the changes happening in the workplace on a day-to-day, annual basis as well, positive company culture is really important. Folks are seeking it out. When you think about the easiest way to improve upon company culture, do you think that a key part of that is really removing and identifying those workplace issues?
Mm-hmm. This is a great, like, where do you start? Right. Is sometimes, and we're like, we want to go here and it wants to be positive. I actually think that's quite a complex situation with the new challenges of hybrid work, remote work. When you look at even from the onset of millennials coming in, right? Even in Canada, 67% at one point was in the workforce. And that meant there was a whole change to culture. So I would answer the question very specifically to the last part, which is what do you think the easiest way is to improve company culture? And it's not to remove issues, it's to understand the issues first. I'm a very kind of slow, deliberate, thoughtful leader. And I look through data, through talking with people and building up the collective. But there's, depending on, I've worked through, as you know, different industries, and each way to approach it is differently. When you just approach the solution or what you think is the solution without looking at the structure or the history of the industry and where it's come from and why we're at this place and what's the kind of externalities that have changed the expectations, you got to spend a lot of time in understanding what the issues are and where they came from first to really do some really great work, in my opinion.
Yeah, to have a really great foundation, also to ask, open-ended questions and have that context behind, why is this happening? What's happening? How can we create systematic change too? Create those non-negotiables as a company and leaders as well. I think that's a strong base. I agree with you there for sure.
Hmm.
One of the things I also wanted to ask as well is, companies, and you mentioned kind of different industries have different opinions or kind of spheres of influence as well in terms of their kind of reach as an employer. When you think about Litera, what would you say the ideal state to work towards looks like in terms of either key pillars or a North Star as well?
Mm-hmm. Rather than even talking about the particular companies and what the North Star is, I think about D&I particular and what a North Star looks like. It changes. I know this sounds really odd, but it changes depending on how the business trajectory is going, where talent is and where you are on the war on talent, how you're building internally. I think with any company, the hope is that the D&I component or leader or space and work is considered a business priority, a strategic business priority. And so that means a lot of other leaders are talking the same language and emulating the same narrative so that it's seen as important to your collective. And that North Star is where every year when you do your rally cries, that's what we always hope for and are working towards where we are now as well, is your people can find themselves in that business trajectory and the value and the mission of the company. That's the North Star, where they can easily see that they are part of what's centric to a company's business priorities.
Absolutely. It can't be something that is siloed out or something that is separate, is directly related to the business. How leaders are talking about celebrating the actions that are happening at the company too. And people know when it's authentically embedded in
That's
and
right.
not as well.
That's right.
I think another part of inclusion and feeling like you can kind of contribute your opinion, whether it's positive, negative, constructive, anything in between, is psychological safety. I would love to know, how do you think about continuing to really cultivate an environment with psychological safety and folks not feeling like they can't speak up?
This is a great question. The psychological safety seems to be, at least from my vantage point, the hottest kind of topic right now. Psychological safety has been around since 2008 in Project Aristotle and Google. So I'm always quite shocked at where we are in different organizations about psychological safety. Some are still using diversity, equity, and inclusion. And when you introduce psychological safety, to them, it's this whole new kind of fluffy academic term. So I love that this is about having a conversation about it. Psychological safety is actually the premise before diversity, equity, inclusion, especially in the inclusive component of it. When we look at diversity, we could have diversity. We maybe are not giving access in underserved or unseen communities the ability to grow and move. And we look at equity and we look at, well, what are the systemic and the barriers and the attitudes that are causing those changes? And inclusion is actually working towards that. But if you don't have psychological safety, all of this is for naught. So the idea of how you cultivate psychological safety, once again, very different, because to approach that happens at the team level, which means you have to have the leadership commitment. And I know that we'll probably end up getting there, but psychological safety is not the job of the D&I leader. It is the commitment and the passion of the leadership committee to ensure that all the way down to the levels and in every team, there is safety to fail. There is safety to speak up. And what the D&I team or the Center of Excellence should be doing, hopefully, if they have that support, and they also have psychological safety, is to be able to say, you may not have the skill set of what we're asking you to create psychological safety. Let's take a step back and let's be able to say, how can we equip our leaders to create an ecosystem of that kind of, support and comfort to roll out. So that's how you cultivate psychological safety, is it's way before we even get to the team level.
Absolutely. And you don't have to be someone who was born with the terminology of psychological safety, know exactly what to do. I think you're right. Understanding the tools you can offer folks, the resources, equip people for success, really define what that looks like is important. And getting down to that team level, having verbal and nonverbal cues from leaders as well is important too. I think, in one study, when we talk about psychological safety, there are different levels too. You mentioned kind of the confidence to fail and then succeed, and really thinking through different ideas. In terms of the study, there are 4 stages. One, where people feel included. The second stage, where people feel like they can really learn something. Stage 3 is where people feel safe to contribute ideas. And stage 4, where people feel like they can challenge the status quo, which, if people are coming from an environment where that wasn't necessarily celebrated, is kind of hard to achieve. Which stage, in your opinion, is most difficult to address or overcome?
I always think of these stages as a little bit cart before horse. So to be honest, number 3. So if I look back, where people feel safe enough to, and then it says like contribute or whatever, that to me should already be the premise before the premise, the beginning one. The number 1 is where people feel included. I'm like, that's the end state, included and belong. I actually always looked at that stage and I was like, hold on a second. What do you mean by that? Right? We have to create the stage first. I think the first stage is, even before the stage, the hardest one is the idea of the introduction of it. Like just the introduction of psychological safety. They're like, what? And I think employees get it. I think leaders are like, what am I supposed to do? Like, this is a lot and I don't understand, or I am doing it. The thing is, we have to be intentional. So the hardest stage is getting to the idea of we are being intentional and consistent as practice. That's what builds psychological safety. So interesting about the stages, but I actually think they should be, shifted. Who am I to wrestle with research? But that's the hardest for me, really, is getting people to feel safe, which means that we start with creating the environment to feel safe, to even get to comment, bring up, have a conversation. Even leaders need to feel safe. I don't know how to facilitate this. I'm not equipped with that. Start with leaders. Start with leaders.
Start with leaders and really understand, do people feel safe? Why do folks not feel safe as well? Look at the system that's currently in place and iterate on that too, and understand people's experiences. People are coming in with different workplace experiences, even if you work in the best company culture right now. I do want to talk about those leaders and those frontline managers as well. Once you have that feedback, which I definitely think is a gift, people are sharing their opinions. If you don't actively listen or do something about it, the odds are that you're going to get feedback next time are very low. What are your recommendations for leaders across the business, any department, to turn feedback into intention and utilize it to carry out different projects?
One of the things that I think is important, and this is where I really need like kind of a key D&I team and leader that have done things, almost having the experience to do so, is how do you have a common, like the narrative, so that it aligns to the business priorities? Leaders understand it's some of the pressure that they already feel, right? Senior leadership is exhausted of trying to be agile and negotiate and navigate the new worlds of work. And we've gone from like the great resignation to the great renegotiation to the great reassignments. I mean, we've seen from McKinsey, it just continues this changing. And so leaders are, definitely exhausted about doing that. And I know we say start with leaders. I think one of the easiest ways you can do that is say, what's the critical issue that's happening that the CEO and the C-suite are bringing up consistently? What is critical? We've talked about the war on talent. That just seems to be in every industry. Align the work of psychological safety or just inclusive work to the idea of we need to retain talent. And this is one of those levers towards retention. Like we know psychological safety in the research has said, right? This is a lever to engagement. Align it. And that will really help leaders make meaning from it as we build them being very intentional about what do you do with psychological safety. The other thing I'll add to it is what metrics are already floating around. So one of the things that's fantastic at Litera that was always really heavy in terms of focus is ENPS. So we have the Net Promoter Score. A lot of people do that. I don't know if every company does ENPS, but it's fantastic, which is how do your employees feel, right? In terms of how do they feel? And so much so, one question, which is, would you reference this company? And what's wonderful about that is that you can align that. Some of the drivers of that is, do I also feel engaged and belong and included in this experience here? Otherwise, I wouldn't reference it. And that's where you start with is, well, some of the work that we're doing is one of the levers that influences ENPS. And leaders get that. They'll start to make, connections to that. Help leaders, right?
Absolutely. Help leaders really help with resources, tools, connecting it to the business, as you were talking about. And just because someone references the business or recommends it to, a friend or family member 6 months ago does not mean you're going to get the same result 6 months from now if you don't continue to work on company culture, retention efforts, diversity, equity, and inclusion, psychological safety. Consistently auditing the employee experience is critical too. As the team continues to grow, you move around, internal mobility. Can you tell me about how you've redesigned a system to be more equitable over the past 2 years? And this could be anything.
I can never take full credit. And the reason why is, and I've said this at a Women in IT series, I was on the panel and I said, D&I is not a one-person game. And that's actually true. I really, really believe it. And so it feels kind of odd to be able to bring in an example because there's always another leader that is speaking about you and for you in the work that we're doing and championing it in different conversations. So there's employees that are talking about it and say, I really believe in the work that we're doing, right? And having that integrity to do so. So in answering this question, it's always a collective view. One of the things that we've done is launched a psychological safety and inclusion survey. Really quite proud. It's the very first time launched. And people aren't really sure about it. It's new, right? It's a newer kind of collective that's coming in, especially in tech, highly transient, growing, an acquisitive company. So really exciting. But then you're introducing a very big, lofty concept, and right across the board with an excellent communication plan, again, by leaders, right? Supporting that. And I think that's one of the things that we're really quite proud of is we haven't just asked for that feedback. We've turned it in. And I think you might be asking, this might be answering maybe a couple of other questions that might come up, but it's the idea that you've created. So what do you do with that information? And when you kind of slice and dice it, you put it per function and you start to give them individually, this is what your people are saying. And this is the great stuff they've said that you've done. And these questions are really specific, a little bit different than an engagement survey. They're asking research-based questions on psychological safety. But what I think is wonderful about that is like, now what we're going to do about it. And how does each level get access to this transparent insights to say, here's what we're learning. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what we need you to do to create psychological safety is be okay to respond to, yeah, this resonates with me. This is what my colleagues said, but it resonates with me. Or no, I think we're doing that really great. And so those are one of the things that I'm really quite proud of that we could not have done without a whole collective of people being on board and doing that. But really quite proud of that.
I think that's a really good example because I think there's something to be said for kind of different questions that are a little bit more open-ended and vague, but for, specific questions around psychological safety, being really detailed and specific around what are you asking about? How can we make these insight-driven decisions? And then the other point that you made too, transparently sharing that out with leaders and folks to understand what you learned as well.
Mhm.
I have a feeling I kind of know the answer to what you're going to say to this next question, but a lot of times for webinars and, this series, we get questions around the organizational structure of D&I teams. From your perspective, do you think diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging work should be under, a specific department like HR and people, or, a separate department, and why?
Mhm. You know what? To be honest, I know I do a lot of podcasts for speaking events, which I'm very honored to do. I really enjoy them. I've never been asked this question, but I have, like, my opinion is not wavering. It's always been that. And I won't go to companies that it is like that, which is, I don't think diversity, equity, inclusion should be under HR.
Yeah.
Nor a very HR focused leader. And that doesn't mean leaders can't be absolutely wonderful and have an HR background. So I shouldn't say that. I do want to leave some flex for that. I think where we're at now in terms of the 2.0 is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and all of the interchanges of those words and how they put it should definitely be distinct. And I'll tell you why. They support HR as a companion, right? But HR is so overwhelmed. It's actually probably not what people thought. HR is so overwhelmed as the backbone of the company, right? In terms of keeping the lights on, understanding and building guardrails, new guardrails, right? As the evolution of work, remote life, what does this look like? People working in different areas of the company are wanting to move, right? Payroll and the differences with that, paternal leave, benefits that people are asking for to be extended, Roe versus Wade, like, you got to kind of look at that and say, HR's got their hands full. There's no need for them to be doing, in addition, shifting a different mindset to be proactive. It's not that they're not inherently within the spirit of looking after the employee, but in a very different way, I feel, infrastructure wise, right? And for different reasons. The same ideas, which is I could never do HR, don't have the background for it, nor the mindset. So my work is very, very different. It works hip to hip. If you're not working with talent, recruitment, and HR closely, you're not doing D&I work as integrative as perhaps more effectively could be. But D&I needs to be separate. It also takes away the punitive and power privilege dynamic that inherently comes with HR. If you get called into HR, there's a different feeling than if you were to tap on D&I and say, can we just chat about something? Or let me bounce this off of you. You need that almost listening post that's safe, that has some power to you and stretch and reach, but doesn't fall within the historical connotation, right, that comes with HR. I think that's very, very important. Very important.
I think that's also really important as well, and speaks to your earlier point around, diversity, equity, inclusion, psychological safety being inherent and a strategic part of the business, and aligning with goals too, and really understanding, you work with all departments and it's a companion to HR and people teams, completely different set of, goals and, together to meet goals. But to your point, the mindset is different too. And it takes a lot of work. It's just not, another side project.
Right.
Well,
it also is it's a different lens to risk. And you need a D&I lens really taught and flexed continuously to support some of the new world of work and how things are happening. And it doesn't always have to fall within an illegal parameter to be a reason why a company or a person, why an employee leaves or is unhappy or stays and is unhappy. You need that help, right? That lens it always gets to be flexed, which I love the work. So you want somebody who loves the work, and they're naturally saying, hey, with this acquisition of company, there's a concentration of this community that falls within here. They have to know that it has nothing to do with them. This shifts the dynamic, and here's how we can help that. You would not even think of that. So really tightly knit, not against, tightly knit with HR.
Tightly knit, working towards the same kind of objectives in terms of North Star and key pillars that we talked about earlier as well. You also mentioned it's not one person or, it's not the DEI's team to ensure that an entire organization is equitable, to ensure that you're meeting these goals as well. Partners, help and guidance, counsel, which I definitely agree with too. What is your philosophy around measuring diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging initiatives, knowing that we don't want to check a box or just look strictly at numbers, but knowing that what gets measured gets invested in at the end of the day too, and it's important to iterate and kind of course correct as well.
Peter Drucker, what gets measured matters. Absolutely, and that's something that I'm so happy I've seen a lot of leaders really get so courageous and bold and powerful about. I'm going to answer this really quickly in two ways. One is, again, when you start to align it to a business objective that's critical, that they're talking about the NPS, and they're talking about retention, that's where I'm going to hone in on and say, here's some tangibles and intangibles. So you need to be able to push that the impact of why people stay is not always measurable. So testimonial, right, of people, I think that's super important. So we talk about measure, and I know that, but we can't always commodify the impact of D&I work. And I'm protecting D&I leaders that way, because that's not always fair. The other thing is D&I leaders have gotten really smart about, we understand the reality of the commodification of talent and keeping them here, and numbers are the only thing to tell us that. And when you launch psychological safety and inclusion in those surveys, when it's linked to research and benchmarked, right, numbers, this is why people stay. I mean, it's researched. What you're doing is saying, when we give each function and department their current numbers on overall, this is what your company or your people are telling you about, you want to move the dial. You have the certain benchmarks of, this is an area of concern. This is an area of focus. If you don't move the dial on that, this will show up in your exit interviews as this. That makes meaning. So you have to be really seasoned, right, about how you make this aligned to measure and progress. Have your own measure and progress, but be really clear about this impacts that measure as well. Because that's the one they care about, right? Those, I don't know who said it, and it certainly wasn't my quote, although I wish it was. And it said, what's interesting to your leaders should be an obsession to you. Right?
That's a good quote. I don't know who said that either, but I will remember that now.
Hopefully you'll just remember me saying it, but I did say somebody else.
Yes, absolutely. I think that we have been talking about kind of different ways that people can approach diversity, equity, and inclusion in terms of a framework, tactical ways to test things out and really hear from your people. I agree that testimonials are important, the qualitative kind of info that you get, and then kind of following just general guidelines of how are we doing in this area? How does this affect the business? Even with the best of intentions, when you're testing things out, people make mistakes, and that is okay as long as you learn from them too. Are there any mistakes you see people making in their either people, retention, diversity, inclusion strategy in general?
I'm remiss to say mistakes, because in this new world of work, we're all kind of really learning, and we're learning like by the seat of our pants at times and drinking from the fire hose. We have to keep the lights on. I mean, we have to get business working, right? Even in academia, even in law and customer service, we're all learning. And I think one of the things that we should know better by now. How about that? That's a little bit more bold
I
and
like that.
definitely a straight shooter. Yeah. So we're all learning, and that's fair. Some things that we should know by now is uh, leaders should be speaking about the initiatives of D&I in their company. Like what a CEO says, like, I'm really quite proud of the leadership that's taken up the message and the narratives. And it's not the behind the scenes, we're all like, oh, like maybe it's like this, maybe it's like lots of conversations. I get to have a meeting with the CEO like every 2 weeks with an update, straight level. And then senior leadership team meetings, executives, open door. This is the environment, which is really, really great. But if I'm the only one, or me and my VP are the only one that are shouting this from the rooftops, it seems very, a side conversation. But that's not what happens, right? We have different people speaking about it, leaders, and that we should know by now, right? A leader should not be speaking about it, because it's on the minds of culture and feeling included. It's incredibly important. And the other thing is not inviting D&I leaders to the table. And one of the questions I've heard and I've seen from other mentors and networks is they talk about, like, I'm always hearing it, like, this happened. And I was like, how come I wasn't there? And then you hear people are like, well, it didn't really have like a D&I lens. It's like, you don't have the D&I lens.
Right.
So a D&I is at the level, it should be at a level that's at the tables to really understand what's happening at the business from a large landscape, right? Because they have to understand, maybe this is not the time to advance this, but if I didn't hear that or know that, we would have lost on that, right? Because we would have done it at the wrong time. Help your D&I leaders be leaders, be at the forefront and do the best for you. So they need to be at tables. I said this on the podcast with Marie Wise. She was amazing. And I said, Shirley Chisholm says, when they don't offer you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair. And I said, I'm at the next iteration that I'm not asking for a folding chair. I'm now asking for a seat.
Yeah,
Right.
we'll see.
So yeah, and I love that she said that. And I was
Yeah.
like, I'm not asking for that folding chair, because that folding chair folds up and it's like, it can invite. It's like, no, I want like this, director seat where you get to sit there. So yeah, those are like some of the things by now that we really want to move the dial on.
I'm definitely going to borrow that phrase as well. Things that we should know by now.
Yeah.
I think it's a
I'm going to
good
write that out.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
The reason why that came up particularly is because the end of year, I often do a post to all D&I leaders. I did a little bit one before, but I said we're both passionate and exhausted by the end of the year. But there is something that I'm putting out, really. It's just like a quick, cool kind of like top 5 things, but it's like for leaders of leaders, right? Things we should know by now for D&I. So
I love
stay
that.
tuned.
And also help your DEI leaders help you by having them in the room, meetings, conversations at the table. Julia, is there anything that I didn't specifically ask that you want to share with folks listening, or any takeaways from the many things you discussed that you hope people bring with them?
Wow. 2 things. Great question. Didn't know you'd ask that. Fantastic. One is, really get to know your D&I leader, know what type of leader that is. So right now I'm starting to help those conversations by saying, I'm a build leader. So I'm not a buy leader. So when people are like, I'm talking about right across my professional experience, people will start off with, we have to hire diversity. I'm like, I want to know why we're losing the people we're losing if that's the case.
Yeah.
And so I am a build. Let's build who we have, because what we automatically do is understand the climate. Why invite with all of that energy people in who won't stay? And so that's really understand the type of leader. Does that fit what you want to do? And if it isn't, maybe listen to that person. Maybe listen, like, is this the leader we need or not? So really understanding your D&I leader a little bit better, I think, is something that we should do. And the other thing is, a lot of D&I work is done off the backs of employees. They are the ones that are pushing for the culture. They are ones putting up their hand, often it appearing or feeling as if it's off the side of your desk. Something that we have done, and there's been a lot of championship about paying employee resource groups, and you get into meritocracy and equity, and what does that look like? And I would not promote that particular way. However, I have pushed and very proud of even where I currently work right now, where there's an employee resource group member who we helped launch an idea, right? It's cultural understanding and team effectiveness. We're a global company. And in that launch, she even had her manager, right? She's a manager of engineering. She's fantastic. And her leader supported this because it was building culture, but really looking at how we can do teams better. And we brought this as an enterprise-wide opportunity. He considered this and created this as one of her KPIs or performance objectives.
I love that.
So, right. So we're rewarding employees for what they're doing for the culture and the organization. We're seeing this work as something beneficial. Reward your employees, recognize your employees who are championing employee resource groups, who are working with your D&I members. They're building the culture where you're not losing your talent. Find ways, right? Find ways to sponsor them because of it, right? I do that. I take employee resource group members and sponsor them to conferences. Invest in your people. McKinsey, right? How do you future-proof your company? And they had 9 different things. The number one that stood out to me was treat your talent scarcer than capital. Treat your talent. Here's an example of that. How to do that.
Find the resources to reward, recognize employees for contributing, and really creating your company culture that is so critical. And your people are your greatest strength, because they're the ones, in the company, working with the team, working with the customers, clients, working internally. Julia, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture. I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you. You are so wonderful. Even our chit chat, Christina's wonderful. FYI to everyone who listens to this. And I'm honored to have asked and been able to just kind of straight talk. That's always exciting. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Of course, I appreciate it. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really believe in both employees and employers being seen, heard, and understood, and really know it's a requirement for the business to succeed overall. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.